Okay, good morning. We're going to call this meeting to order, and the time is 9:09 a.m. Today's Thursday, September 13th, and this is day one of the Physical Therapy Board of California of two-day meetings. And we are meeting in the Department of Consumer Affairs hearing room located at 2005 Evergreen Street in Sacramento. Could we please have roll call?
Alicia Rabene, amen.
Here.
T.J. Watkins.
Yeah.
Jesus Dominguez.
Present.
Daniel Drummer.
Here.
Katarina Ellaby.
Present.
Tanya McMillian.
Present.
All members are present and the board has a quorum.
Thank you. And so you have in front of you, the meeting minutes from our June meeting. And we can take the time to go through and look at these, or if the board would like to have more time to look at these and compare your notes, we can decide to revisit these at our next meeting.
I would suggest we might be able to review them either at lunch today or at lunch and over this evening and potentially take care of them today or early tomorrow morning.
Yeah, I think tomorrow's going to be pretty full, so we might not get to them. Well, we probably won't get to them tomorrow. But how do the other members feel about maybe taking some time at lunch or later and seeing if we can come back to it? The thing is that we have closed session planned for the afternoon, and we don't plan to come back into open session. Do you have any thoughts, Mr. Kaiser?
Yeah, I guess my biggest concern is just the time constraints. The closed session period is going to run from day one into day two, and there's quite a bit of work to do in that regard. But I think we can try to get it in where it fits in, if that's the case. I'm just a little hesitant to commit to that. I think what I hear resounding, though, is that you'd like time to review it. And so deferring it to the next meeting is still appropriate. There's nothing wrong with that. But if we can try to accommodate it in the schedule between today and tomorrow, we can try.
Mm-hmm. Any other thoughts from the members?
I would like time to review it, whether at lunchtime today or overnight.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Drummer?
I will leave it to your discretion, Madam President.
Okay. So I think right now, let's see if members can take some time today, this lunch period, to review them. And when we come back into open session tomorrow, we'll revisit it. And if members feel like they need more time and we need to put it off into the next meeting, we can do that. Or if we feel pretty comfortable with what we have, we can move forward. Okay? All right. Next is agenda item number 4, which is our meeting calendar. And so, any comments about our 2018 calendar?
I'm just curious as to whether we have a location established for the December meeting yet.
No, at this time we don't. We're still kind of deciding between two different locations and possibly a newly introduced third, but we should have that information out, well, for planning purposes, I would think within the next 2 to 3 weeks.
It is a meeting that we like to do in the Bay Area.
Correct.
If we can't secure a location, would the board be open to coming back to Stockton to UOP if we can get that in place in time?
Absolutely up to the board. And the mandate is actually Northern California.
Okay.
And so there's an argument to be made that Stockton is still Northern California.
Mm-hmm.
I think the idea really is just that we try to get as much access to the licensing population and to the stakeholders as possible. And the debate that's happening between the locations right now kind of deals with that. We have some go-to schools that we know that we can rely on. We're trying to mix it up a little bit and keep it fresh and introduce some new programs. And there's a little bit of a feeling out process in that to see if certain campuses can accommodate our needs, or if that would even serve the purpose, if there's classes during that period of time, so that we have access to their applicants for future licensees. The most recent addition to that is a program that we think might potentially be something. I think we'll actually have a board meeting there at some point in the future. It's just whether or not they can accommodate the December timeline. But if UOP could help us with that, I think that's something we consider as well.
Yeah.
And at this point, that's what we're looking for, is the first one out of the three that could actually make a commitment and give us, the space is the one we're going to go with.
Any other comments on the 2018 calendar? Okay. And any comments on the 2019 calendar? Any problem with the dates listed so far? And this is something I suppose we'll probably adopt at our December meeting, but does anyone foresee any issues with the dates so far? And looking into next year, does staff have any idea of places they might want to go just yet, or not just yet?
We are, in that same kind of vein, looking for new programs, but we have backups for the dates in 2019 already.
Okay. Any public comment on the calendar? All right. So let's move right along to agenda item number 5, Executive Officers Report.
There are just a few things that I wanted to bring your attention to. From a selfish kind of perspective, I'm happy to introduce April Beauchamps as the communication and education analyst, because she's managed to take a load off of me and get some projects done, and she's hit the ground running. So we'd like to welcome her. We have a vacancy in the administrative services unit that we're currently recruiting for. And you'll see that on the second page of the report, there are a couple other issues regarding the PTBC relocation. You've heard me mention in the past that our lease terminates in March of next year. And we have explored options and looked at properties in the area, Rancho Cordova, North Sac, those kind of things. But we have managed to secure space in this building at a reasonable rate. Now what we're struggling with is how long it's going to take to move from the suite that we're in, because the space that we're requiring is large and would need quite a bit of construction to accommodate us. So that process is lengthy, anywhere from 12 to 24 months. 24 months is usually the norm. So, and that process would be starting from March of next year. So, and you'll see statistically in the report, after our DGS survey was done, it turns out we were right. We're about 4,000 square feet today, but to spec, we should have about 7,700 square feet. So without, making 2-story cubicles or something like that, we're at max capacity. So, which I think, staff should be commended for that, because it's been quite a while that we've been at that saturation. And so, as far as how long it's going to take for the move, we might be in a situation where we have to move twice in a short period of time, right? So if we're moving upstairs to just get into a more spec'd space for our needs, there is that larger restructure plan that I brought to your attention at the last meeting, where we take all of Business Consumer Services and Housing Agency, and the plan is to put us all in the same place off of Richards Boulevard in 2025. And so while we could be potentially moving in 2020, the latter part of 2020, we might then have to turn around and move again. So that's something to keep in mind.
Which would be who knows, another $868,000?
I would venture to say it's probably going to be a much more significant cost. It's estimated to cost about $880 just to move from downstairs to upstairs within the same building. Again, that includes quite a bit of construction costs, but moving across town would be much more expensive.
Any board comment on 2 moves in 5 years for $1.5 million or more?
I noticed in the budget that we added an additional $200,000 into our fund. How do we plan on raising the additional $468,000 for this move?
That's an excellent question. So where I thought we were being proactive in reverting some money in each fiscal year with the idea of planning towards a move. And this fiscal year, we put $200,000 in last year, $200,000 in this year, so we're at $4. And we thought we were being, the ant, not the grasshopper, and, saving for that winter. But 887 was quite a surprise. But the Department of Consumer Affairs Budget Office is working on a BCP that encompasses all of the evergreen tenants. And in that BCP, it would account for the increase in square footage, the increase in rate in square footage, but also one-time setup costs. And so our fund condition is healthy enough to support that. That's not really the issue. It's really budget-wise how we would manage to come up with the other $487,000. And so they would account for that in that BCP. And so it would be a one-time pull from the fund. And while I say we could afford it in the fund condition, we could just afford it, right? That would take your months in reserve from 7 and 8 months down quite a bit. And so we would have to really kind of tighten up the purse strings a little bit.
So the 2-move option is really not an option because at 1.5 million, there's just not without really stretching this, there's not the money to do that.
Yeah.
So a 1-move option would have to be explored to its limits to see how that is possible.
Without actually having done those projections yet, as far as hard numbers, there is that difficulty. We are in a situation right now where we've combated this from both directions, right? We had a recent fee increase. We were really living beyond our means, spending more than we were taking in. The last year and a half, we've been generating more revenue than we spend. And so we've been, in a good economic situation there. The move is going to put a little bit of a dent in that, but the 2 to 3 years in between might allow us to kind of build a little bit more as that revenue has not only grown through the fee increase, but also the size of the licensing population contributes to that. Whether it's enough or not, without having the projections in front of me, that's another thing. Boards have, in the past, had to contemplate fee increases to account for things like this. It's not ideal. You don't want to be caught unaware and having to do those kind of things, but it's not unusual either.
Jason, can you remind us about the move to the centralized location? Is that going to be a mandatory option? If it is mandatory, is there a way to seek assistance because it's being made mandatory? And
There is I wouldn't say mandatory is really the right word. Highly encouraged is probably the better way to put it. But I know that because of necessity and fit, there will be some boards and bureaus that do not move to that location for some very good reasons. Contractor state licensing board, those larger boards that also have things inside of them like laboratories and facilities that can't really be easily replicated at another location have all the reason to stay where they are. But some of the smaller boards and some of the other departments that are included in this project are going to be expected to make that move. The property that is being, that's part of the project is a state-owned property. And so I have seen consolidations like this in the past where the legislature has appropriated general funds for the one-time move kind of costs. But moving forward from that point, it would definitely come out of our funds. Now, I've also seen where they've provided a stipend to the square footage rate for a period of time. So there's a lot of things that could be done to make those things work. I think it's a little bit off in the distance that we haven't had those kind of conversations yet, but it's definitely something that we should, keep an eye on and be aware of.
Yeah, it's a little off in the distance, but it's also near,
Yeah. Yeah.
close enough. I guess just thinking that we're going to spend this much money for a move which is way overdue and much needed, to have to turn around and put out that money again is just concerning.
It's not the most timely sequence of events. Now that the survey's been done, and DGS is aware of the imbalance, we have to do it. The move has to happen here. Trying to decide not to, because we're wary of the second move, I don't think is really an option.
Any further board comment on that? And any public comment on that? And Caesar, do we need some time to take some time for anything? Are we okay?
Good now.
Okay. And
Thank you.
The other issue that I have to brief you on with some information is the board's strategic plan has been beautified and finalized by the Department of Consumer Affairs Publication Design and Editing. And I have that to distribute to you as members today. So I'll pass them down. Sal, if you mind. There.
thank you. Thank you. Okay, I have one.
And so I'll give you a few seconds to peruse through that.
Yes. So, Dr. Drummer, thank you for reminding me that one of the important things that we want to do when we start a meeting is to read our mission. And I believe at the last meeting I had, Mr. Watkins read it. So, Ms. Ellaby, would you mind reading the mission for us today, please?
Is it in here?
Yeah, right in the centerfold.
The mission of the Physical Therapy Board of California is to advance and protect the interests of the people of California by the effective administration of the Physical Therapy Practice Act.
Thank you. And so as we peruse the pages, I'd invite board members to comment.
There's a lovely photo of you, too.
The one thing I found so striking about that photo is up until then, I guess I didn't really realize how short you guys are.
That you were standing on the box.
A very large box. So moving forward, we'll be working in collaboration with DCA Solid to create the action plan. And so we'll work through those goals and objectives and identify the steps and action plans, who's responsible. They will help us facilitate that and create a published action plan that we'll be able to use and bring to the board to demonstrate progress from one board meeting to another.
Well, thank you for this. I like the layout. I like the ease of read. Yeah, it is beautiful. The graphics are great. As a physical therapist, I see the graphics and think, yeah, That's it. Any other further board comment?
I think that this will be a very valuable handout at the association's conference next week in Santa Clara.
Absolutely.
Any public comment? Okay. And anything else, Mr. Kaiser?
No, only in that, if there's anything else in the executive office report that the members have, questions, I'd be happy to answer.
And some of these things we'll get to in the later presentations tomorrow. It looks like we'll get some details. And again, welcome, April Beauchamp, to the PTBC. Thank you for being here. Okay. So moving on to agenda item number 6, discussion and possible action for the increase in the exempt level of the executive officer. Yeah, that's okay. I asked for this to be placed on the agenda. I think last year it was a consensus that we want to revisit this topic every year, kind of see where we are, revisit it, and talk about it a little bit more. And I want to thank Liz for putting together this briefing paper and all of the materials that are in our materials book. And so hopefully board members got a chance to kind of reacquaint themselves with this issue. And I did, again, looked over it again and looked at the growth of the board from when we were initially made a level O back in 2000, and looked at all of the growth with the charts that were included in the materials. And remember that we were just elevated to a level N last year, even though we requested an L. And so, do any board members have any comments that they want to make about this?
Yeah, when we read this, we've had this layout before and everything. The blind spot still remains what makes them make that decision and who makes that decision. So in that year, we're still not established how that decision gets made, because if it's just based on the numbers that we present, this should be an easy decision. But we presented these numbers before. It moved the needle, from 2 level N. But I think if our game plan is just to resubmit it again and see, okay, let's put it through the system again until we get where we go, then I don't think there's anything that materially has changed in how we present it. Another letter, I will pursue this. I would suggest pursuing this again, and we can get feedback from all the other parties about how they feel about pursuing it again. But I think this probably you should keep the pressure on until someone tells me to take the pressure off. Hopefully after we achieve the goal.
I agree with TJ. This is a half step. We asked for a complete step. And so to me, even though I appreciate the half step, it's not what we were requesting. And it's almost a slap in the face again. And so I'm with TJ. Let's keep applying the pressure.
Thank you. Any other board member comment? And so I appreciate your question, TJ. It's not the materials before us that we have any problem with or question about. And I'm hearing that it's not something we want to do just for the sake of doing it. We don't want to just put pressure just because we want the answer that we want. It's telling here. The information is telling here where we should be. And where we're requesting to be for the benefit of our board, for the benefit of the public, for the benefit of our licensees, to do the job that we need to do, have the ability for the board to, like for me, I always go back to Monty and our probation monitor, getting him some help, and getting him some help would be such a benefit to the public, such a benefit to our licensees, and being able to reach out and meet with them face to face versus just doing a phone call or an email or that sort of thing. So I would love to see our executive officer have the ability to staff our board as needed without always trying to fill in with glue.
I agree with you, Alicia. It's a public protection issue at the end of the day. When the executive officer is misclassed, the staff doesn't have the proper structure to fulfill the mission of the organization. And, not to bring in the space issue that we're having already, but it's all interconnected, We're doing the best with what we have, and I don't feel like we're being heard, about what our needs are. And yes, the acknowledgement and the N level does help, but it doesn't resolve the issue.
If I may, it is a difficult situation in that we have two issues that seem to be at odds with each other, and that the board is growing in ratio to the profession. The licensing population has grown and necessitates a larger board to regulate it. And the confines of the suite that we're in today don't, accommodate that very well. But when we talk about assisting Monty and having a second probation monitor or some additional licensing staff, to deal with the influx of applications and the influx of the PTA profession, and that population is blowing up. We wouldn't have any place to put those people currently, right? So it's a difficult situation in that we know what we need. It's just everything seems to be just out of reach at that point. But I would like that once we do move from 4,000 square feet to 7,700 square feet, to be able to fill those voids as quickly as possible, and start to yield those efficiencies and those gains. If there's any questions that members have about the data that's been presented, I'm happy to answer them. We wanted to just freshen up the data with this next fiscal year's information. And if there's anything that you think that we should add or subtract, we're open to that input too. I will tell you that, we have received word from the Department of Consumer Affairs previous personnel officer that this is package-wise one of the best presentations they've seen. They use it as a template for other boards that are in the similar situations and looking to do it. So I think it's very thorough and by the numbers, and I think the data tells its own story.
So let's go back to TJ's point of how can we get an answer? Or, is this just part of being a board and asking for something and we just get an answer and that's it? How can we get rationale or any feedback at all as to why I'm looking at the chart on page 20 and obviously we've been in O for how many years? 17 years? And so in 17 years, we grew this much and we were at an O and we were given N. But really, our budget, our amount, our population, our staff is at an L. And that's why we asked for an L. It's because we should be where the numbers say we should be. So I don't think we're reaching for the sky. I think we're being pretty objective And so if we're being objective, we want to know, how can we get an answer? And I'm not asking you this, Jason, but how can we get an answer as to why an L is not justified?
I'm glad you're not asking me that because I don't have an answer for it. But, one thing that I would say is that without that feedback, without that additional guidance, that maybe we're off track a little bit. And there's a component that I'm not aware of and that's part of the argument that we just don't meet. The next best strategic move is to continue to make the request until it becomes obvious that the powers that be have to provide us with that guidance so that we stop making the request, or they're convinced by the argument that we're presenting.
Another thought without trying to be disrespectful or too pushy is, do board members feel that we may come to a point where we can ask those who appointed us for guidance on this? I mean, because we aren't getting answers anyway. How can we get the answers? I mean, we can keep knocking on the door, and doing that year after year, but without that feedback.
I think that's an excellent suggestion, but I know I can. So if we all agree to it, I'm willing, definitely willing to reach out.
I'm just looking for information, feedback, guidance, so something to think about.
I think one thing to be cautious of is third-party communications. I know it's addressed in the board's administrative manual. So I think that before any action like that is taken, to have members addressing congresspersons or the governor, there is a procedure laid out for that, and there has to be, I believe, authority from the chair, possible agreement on the board as to who is communicating what, so that individual board members aren't all sending, separate messages directly. But that's something that, we can work on if the board's interested in, but making sure to follow the appropriate protocols.
Yeah. I mean, based on what you might find, even a letter from the board addressed to someone, our appointing powers, and maybe putting our concerns out there and just asking for that feedback and guidance and hopefully getting an answer, possibly.
Yeah, I think, that accomplishes the goal that it is an approved, message from the board, and the board is unanimous in that opinion, as opposed to having multiple opinions being expressed to third parties without necessarily having it vetted by the other board members.
So what's your suggestion to move forward on something like that if the board agrees?
So there are multiple options. I suppose the board can consider having a committee work on a letter. It could direct staff to work on a letter and present it to the board for approval. Or, the board has taken the position in the past of making a motion that kind of reflects the board's opinion of itself through the motion. So those are some ways, I think, that I'm able to think of right now. But it's something I can certainly think about some more and work with staff on options for the board.
Do you think the staff is able to absorb one more duty? Keyword absorb.
We're certainly able to assist in the drafting of a letter in representation of the board. That's not an issue. I guess the question that I would have the members consider is, And I appreciate Salwa's input about maybe even a committee amongst the members to do that, so that I would not want to be seen as participating in or having undue influence on the members' judgment with their appointing power. And so I'm a little hesitant to allow myself or staff to be involved in that communication.
Well, I'm looking at, since we are reviewed by the Business and Professions Committee, I want to, well, I don't know this, maybe someone can answer this question. How about engaging with the chair of that committee and bring this matter before them? Because if they are the committee that ultimately gives opinion about our existence, then I think we can actually call forth and ask them about the health of this existence. Because that's what we are talking about. We are identifying some symptoms that are going to make us really sick down the line. Mind my little deviation from proper, but this is the best way now to describe it. And ask them. That's the only people I can think about that would have a whole bunch of people, but we are directed to the chair of that committee and call it forth from that. Because, I think some of the appointing powers also sit on that committee. If we address it to the chair, then we actually address it to another body. And I think that could give us some kind of one step closer. Just a suggestion. That's
Sure.
a suggestion.
Sure. I think it's a good idea. I think that maybe going through the chain of command and seeing if we can get an answer as we move up, but that's,
Yeah.
Definitely part of the top of the chain of command. How does the board feel about possibly creating a committee of 2 or 3 to draft a letter to submit to, I guess, going up the chain of command? Making sure that we are hitting each step.
So, with regards to the number of individuals on a committee, we'll take a minute to look back on it, but I think, we would advise that the committee be kept to, I think, 2.
Okay, yeah.
And that would make it easier for that committee, I think, to function within the, considering the confines of the certain requirements. So,
Mhm.
I think forming a committee is a better approach than directing staff because of the potential conflict of interest optics.
Okay. Any further board comment?
Yeah, and what is that chain of command? I mean, I'm curious because I don't know that. What is that chain of command?
My understanding is we are board under the umbrella of DCA. The next step is agency. And the next step would be our appointing powers, the governor's office. As far as a decision on this, I believe it's the administration. As far as drafting a letter to our appointing powers, then that would be, whoever appointed each one of us.
Who was it who approved the change from O to N? Who took that? Who took that action?
Or do we know?
It's difficult to determine at what point in the process that decision was made.
From here, it went to
Agency.
agency.
CalHR is also involved, and from an approval of both of those, assuming that it wasn't altered in any way up to that point, it would go to the governor's office for signature. And so it could be redlined altered at a number of different points, so. I think the strength of the idea of a committee is that those two members, understanding the want of the rest of the members, would be able to have those kind of conversations with each of those steps in the process. And so, you know, involving the Department of Consumer Affairs, Board and Bureau Relations, the director, and then, you know, having that be the next step to agency and so on and so forth might be helpful.
And so last year, when the request was submitted, it was submitted to whom?
It is submitted to the Department of Consumer Affairs Personnel Office for formalization, finalization, and then that package is then forwarded on to agency and CalHR.
And so since they're using our request as a model now for others,
Without speaking for them, I believe that they did not have any concerns with our requests, that they were in alignment with state policy, the SAM manual, and so forth.
If they're using our requests as a model, I wonder if they're using it also to base their decision upon, like, best practice decision. My concern is that I may be alone here, but I don't have a clear sense of who had the final say. Seems that that's the person, at least from the initial efforts, that we need to target.
Mm-hmm.
Target's not the right word. I take that back. Identify and engage in conversation.
I think a big part of the challenge, though, too, is that because of the frequency of people shifting positions, shifting offices within the state organization, that one individual may have a certain mindset about how they feel about reviewing salaries and granting requests, and somebody else might have a very different view. And so it doesn't actually end up coming down to the office that it sits in, that it depends on the person who's holding the pen. And I think that's another layer that we have to remember, and it's a challenge with all of this. Does the establishment of a committee require a motion, or can the chair do that?
I believe that I can appoint members to a committee that will meet our needs, although I would ask for volunteers who felt they might want to do so. I see TJ Watkins,
I'd be happy to join the committee.
Katerina Ellaby. Okay, so we have two volunteers, Katerina Ellaby and TJ Watkins.
So, I just want to help clarify. Now, I'm reading from a guide on the Open Meetings Act, and the Open Meetings Act indicates that board meetings have historically been required to be noticed and open to the public, except where closed session is authorized. Committee and subcommittee meetings, when less than a quorum of the board and president, are also required to be noticed and open to the public. Only exception is for a committee that consists of fewer than 3 and does not exercise any authority of a state body delegated to it by that state body. So I think, given that information, it would be important to clarify whether or not this committee has authority to, draft the letter and move forward and send the letter and take actions on behalf of the board, or whether they have the delegated authority to create this letter, but then bring it back to the board for then board action, and then, authorizing the staff to execute, like, for example, mailing the letter, in order to know what open meetings requirements apply.
So I would propose a motion then with the establishment of a committee to draft a letter in support of changing salary category N to category L for the PT board executive officer. Draft and prepare supporting documentation with the request for presentation at the board's December meeting.
I second. Any further board comment?
Just a point of clarity. The letter that the committee would be drafting for the board's approval at the next meeting is intended to be delivered to someone other than the normal process, right? So what we have here before you now is the information that we would typically put together and submit to DCA to start the process, and we would wait for a response, however long that may be. But this is a little bit different in that you're looking for an alternative to seek out guidance.
Mm-hmm.
So I think first I would look to preparing the request, preparing a letter that goes with the request through the normal channels. If we want to have, we could have an additional charge to the committee, which would be to prepare a letter for board members to present to their appointing authority or whoever else we decide might be important in that process to help support the modification.
I just want to clarify two things. You know, when we prepare the request, so this is going to be someone that we say that sits outside of the process right now, right? So when we prepare the letter, do we have to submit all these documents? Because I'm very confident in the documents. And I think I want to be really be more focused on the ask, so that the ask take the dominance, so that it could lead to a different, more in-depth, okay, can you present that documentation? We can say we have the documentation. Because as you go up these levels, people don't want to see too much information. But the ask is the central point. And the ask in this is that we just want to move this executive level, exempt level to level L. And I think that has to be that has to be the conversation starter. And then the questions are up of why did this not happen? If I'm reading the letter, I want to understand, so why did this not happen? You know, and that starts a different conversation. They generally are not going to go through all the documentation. We have the documentation. We have confidence in the documentation. It's just sometimes very difficult just to even get to that ask, that primary ask. And that's what I think I really want to focus on if I was going to develop a strategy around this.
So it sounds like there's two separate issues. So one is, as a board, do we want to move forward and submit our request again for letter L, exempt letter L? That would be one piece that we can continue and do that. The second piece would be the committee drafting a letter seeking feedback, guidance, answers, a meeting as to what it is that, or just some information. I mean, as a physical therapist, sometimes without the education, a patient can be pretty confused and have certain ideas about their condition. You give them the education and they're like, okay, I get it now. I'm all right with it. If we just got that feedback to tell us what it is, that we need to be okay with, then tell us. But just getting a no makes us just want to keep asking. So, in a sense, we need to be educated. We need to know why, because there's a reason why we weren't given L. So what is that? Because maybe what it is, we can sit with that for a bit. I don't know. But without knowing, we have no other choice but to keep asking for what seems like is justified. So.
I just have a question of clarification. Do we envision those two issues moving in parallel? Because I think, and do those documents run the same path along the same line of desks?
Mm-hmm.
Because if I were on the receiving end, I would have a document that's asking me for something, as well as weighing a document that's asking me why this isn't happening. Almost like they have some premonition that we're going to deny this again. So I don't know. I don't pretend to be able to put myself in the shoes of those decision makers, but the data is compelling. I don't think we need to add any more data to this package, and so I wonder that the wheel hasn't squeaked for 17 years, right? So as far as the upper levels of the administration is concerned, they're doing their job. We haven't been notified that there's any deficiency or any inability to continue doing their job. Don't ask, maybe it's don't ask, don't get in retrospect, so that the reclassification to N perhaps in their mind was, well, we're moving in that direction. Let's just not move too quickly, because we've had 17 years to do this. Maybe it's another 17 years. I hope not. But, I'm just trying to, we've asked for feedback before, and I don't think we've ever gotten a straight answer, because the data seems to support this compellingly. And, if it's a budget thing, I would appreciate hearing, it's just a money thing. We just don't see that this is a priority in the overall budget of the enterprise here. But I haven't heard that directly. Just assumption only.
That's interesting, because now, and I'm just looking at it to get to goal. So if I'm sitting in whoever's position, I would just say, okay, you've submitted this and I gave you it. Or anybody looking, we achieved that goal. We gave you N. All right? So it's all done with that first set of information, which is this information. So we would probably have to resubmit this and put this back in the channel, but then open up the top end of this channel. Because then we needed to literally have to prepare someone to receive this on their desk. And so, we just started this process again. And the reason why we started this process is because after 17 years, giving us a click when we need a leap is not enough. And I think that from a step strategy point of view, that is thorough. It doesn't step on anybody's toes, but we do tap the top end of where this is going to go.
Not to intervene, but
Sure.
I do think that TJ has a point in the sense that should those discussions be had by the committee with any of the parties involved in this process, having the actual package in the system and in process is an extremely important part. You'll see in the materials that from the last year's package, there's essentially the letter of request to have DCA started on our behalf. I don't think there's any real need to change that letter. I mean, I realize it's redundant, but the request is redundant. So I think starting that is probably the first step. If the board has delegated the authority to the committee to draft a second letter in support of the request, I think one of the other things that might be effective is for that committee member to be delegated the authority to have communications with those stakeholders along the way. And so if that's a meeting between the committee and DCA as the first step, that's one thing. And then so on and so forth through the process, with the committee coming back and reporting their findings to the board.
To that end, I want to take the opportunity to just review a provision of the board's administrative manual. Now, the board's manual is not law, but it is the board's policy. So, it's the board's policy call whether it wants to follow it or not, but thought I'd review the relevant provision. This is a section entitled Communications, Other Organizations, Individuals, and Media. All communications relating to any board action or policy to any individual organization or a representative of the media shall be made only by the board president, his or her designee, or the executive officer. Any board member who is contacted by any of the above should inform the board president or executive officer, who shall then inform the Office of Public Relations of the contact. Just a reminder, the board may want to consider, observing these as we proceed.
What you just read, does that have to do with media relations?
Not only media relations, just any essentially party outside of the board. So if a board member is communicating with any party outside of the board about potential board action or board policy, this seems to fall into the category of board policy, then this section would apply.
And so if it is someone appointed or designated by the board president, is it allowed? Is that the committee?
That's right.
Okay.
And I think, yes, that's right. So it says here that made only by the board president or his or her designee or the executive officer. So I think, what Jason's recommendation here is appropriate in the context of this provision. It's just kind of a reminder of for the board president, for yourself, Madam Chair, to that this would be a designation, and perhaps we have the whole board here, so we have the benefit of the board's input about, specifying who this individual is authorized to communicate with, that they are authorized to communicate with those individuals, what they're authorized to communicate, so that there are clear guidelines as to what that delegation is, so that it's not more, open-ended and meandering.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So let's start with resubmission of the package. If there's a board member who wants to make a motion for resubmission of the package.
Well,
Madam Chair, I believe we have a motion on the
Yeah.
table
Oh,
already.
sorry. Can we read that motion back that I seconded?
Do you have it? Sorry.
I think I have it, yes. Establish a committee to draft a letter changing the salary category for the PT Board Executive Officer with a request for presentation for the board's December meeting.
I think I had a little more. So the motion, establish a committee to draft a letter changing the salary category L of the PTBC board, executive officer, prepare and draft supporting documentation for presentation at the board's December 2018 meeting. Dr. Drummer, does that seem to capture the entirety of the motion?
I editorialized a little bit when I was reading what I had written down. Let's go back to what I wrote just to see if we've got it. Whereas the evidence indicates the current salary compensation for the executive officer of the Physical Therapy Board of California is clearly insufficient, given the growth of the board and level of responsibility, I move to authorize establishment of a committee to draft and prepare supporting documentations with a request for an increase to salary category L for presentation to the board's December 2018 meeting.
Do we want to make mention that, because it sounds like this is a first request to me, do we want to make mention that this is a continuing request?
I think to leave it like this because we're now at N, so it is a new request to move from N to L. Even though it is a request that started more than 3 years ago. I remember well.
Makes sense.
Will the motion give us the sufficient authority, the committee, to submit the letter? Well, submit the letter to all the people that we may or may not have meetings with?
Not yet.
Not yet. So this is just the first one.
This is step
Okay,
one, and
perfect.
then we will. Then I'm working on a second charge for the
Authority
committee
part.
for part 2.
Perfect.
Yeah. But as I think that it's important to have the request get submitted, as we've discussed, as the primary piece, because if we don't have the request in, it's really a moot point to go and ask anybody else to do something when the original when we don't have a new request in yet.
And I think the board should review the letter in its entirety before we submit it.
Mhm.
So the distinction being from the normal process is where the initial request is prepared by staff, the letter is drafted and issued to the Department of Consumer Affairs and signed by the board president. This letter would be drafted by the committee and adopted by the full board in December. And by then, that process will have been with DCA for 4 months. And I think sequentially that works out well.
With immense gratitude to staff for compiling in excess of 200 pages of documentation that clearly supports this argument.
So I still second. Any further board discussion? And do we have any public comment? And do we need a roll call vote?
Alicia Ben-Amen,
Aye.
TJ Watkins,
Aye.
Jesus Dominguez,
Aye.
Daniel Drummer,
Aye.
Katerina Ellaby,
Aye.
Tanya McMillian,
Aye.
6-0, motion carried.
Thank you.
Madam Chair, I move to charge the committee with to draft an additional letter that can be used in conversations with agency, CalHR, appointing authorities, and are there any others that should be included?
DCA?
DCA?
Did you say administration?
Appointing authority, I
Okay.
think, would cover that.
Sure.
So in rank order, agency, CalHR, or agency,
DCA?
which one first?
DCA.
DCA first, agency,
Mhm.
CalHR, and appointing authorities.
Mhm.
I apologize. Can that be read back one more time?
Move to charge the committee to draft an additional letter that can be used in conversations with DCA, agency, CalHR, and appointing authorities.
So the motion says that can be used in conversations. I'd recommend clarifying in whose conversations. Would that be the committee members' conversations? Is it also delegating authority to the committee members to have conversations with employees of those entities?
Dr. Strummer, is it your intent to have that letter be a support tool that after the December meeting, when the committee has brought back the initial letter, if it's so, if it be the will of the board to then have the committee go out and have those conversations, this would be a tool that they use in those conversations?
Exactly. I see this as a secondary document
Okay.
that is not the letter that goes with the request. But this is supporting, additional supporting information.
Yeah, so designed to be used for conversations, but not the authority to have those conversations just yet is the clarity. That would come after the December meeting.
Yes.
So I would like to recommend some changes to the motion to help clarify that point. Perhaps something like motion to charge the committee to draft an additional letter that, after approval by the board at the December meeting, at the December 2018 meeting, can be used in board committee member conversations with employees of DCA, agency, CalHR, and appointing authorities.
I would just remove the reference to the December meeting with this one. And just say after approval by the board in case, because if we say at the December meeting and it doesn't happen until March, then we've hamstrung ourselves. So I would just say after approval by the board.
And we're tasked when drafting the minutes, that the minutes, very accurately reflect the motion that was made. So an additional clarifying point for the motion is, instead of referring to agency in general, that the motion refer to the California Business, Consumer Services, and Housing Agency
Thank
as the agency we're referring to. And the California Department of Human Resources. And is there clarification on what's meant by appointing authorities? That would be the board members appointing authorities?
Yes.
And so that involves the offices of 3 individuals. It involves the governor's office, it involves the office of the Senate Pro Tem, and the office of the Leader of the Assembly,
And it's actually the Senate Rules Committee.
not the Senate Pro Tem.
No.
Thank you.
And I might recommend where it says can be used in board committee member conversations with employees of those entities, maybe clarifying board committee member conversations, either something like regarding the contents of the letter or in, advocacy of the position stated in the letter. So to clarify, what conversations those committee members are being authorized to have.
Because this point, we're talking about just drafting the letter, and as long as I would want to reserve that aspect of it until after the board approves the letter. I don't think it's necessary to include those pieces at this time. Once the board reviews and approves the letter, then we would entertain that motion to how that would be used in those conversations.
So would the motion read then, motion to charge the committee? Will the committee have a name, or we refer to the committee?
I like to use exempt level increase, although I don't know if that's,
That's appropriate.
yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I know we've talked about earlier using EO salary, in the title, but it's about that and it's about more.
Mm-hmm.
So perhaps,
Quick question. So first part of this, we submit the letter and the whole package goes into the system. And the committee is charged at that first level with just writing that letter, right? So now we are further downstream. A suggestion. Can we create that motion once we have that information, so that we have actual information to draft the motion from, once we have the information in front of us about information that has come back, as opposed to working so far downstream in anticipation. This is kind of the idea that what we want to move forward. But what I always suggest is keeping the stuff clean from the execution part in that step order. We know what the next step is. Is it required or necessary at this stage to put that motion forward? Is just a question.
And I think that was my statement about trying to clarify that this is only about the committee drafting a letter and presenting a letter at a board, hopefully the next board meeting, so that the board can discuss the content of that letter and what our next step will be.
Yeah.
Rather than making this huge package deal right now, which exactly what you're saying. I don't know that that's the right step to do. I think that we have a letter drafted. We have the letter with the package drafted to be able to submit, and then we'll see where we go with the letter to talk to all of these other authorities after that. So I think if we can get a letter drafted at this point for us for the board to review, then we'll decide which step we want to take next. I think that makes the most sense.
I'm all on board.
So we have a second motion on the table from Dr. Drummer.
so the motion had a first, it hasn't had a second, and I think, before it was seconded, I wanted to provide assistance in helping refine the motion language to make sure it's clear. That, doesn't necessarily mean that, the board has to, second or approve the motion. I just, in case it is approved, I want to make sure that motion language that's on the table is clear. And so I think I heard that the committee name, one suggestion was exempt level increase committee. So I'll just read back, the suggested motion language with that title. And, if the board wants a different title, it can be changed. But, based on some of the discussion I've heard, the recommended motion language might be motion to charge the exempt level increase committee to draft an additional letter that, after approval by the board, can be used in board committee member conversations with employees of the Department of Consumer Affairs, the California Business and Consumer Services and Housing Agency, the California Department of Human Resources, and with the board members appointing authorities.
Mm-hmm.
So I didn't hear the words executive officer in front of that. Do we need that? Does everybody know what exempt level increase committee is in reference to?
We can add that in. Executive officer exempt level increase.
Yeah, I'm just
Or-
not sure I heard that. It's what was in my head, but. I
No,
don't
you're
know.
correct. It's not in there, and I think that would could be further modified for that clarification in there. So it could say, motion to charge the exempt level increase committee to draft an additional letter regarding the executive officer exempt level salary increase. Is that what it's called? Exempt level.
I think that's what it is. I don't know that it's necessary to utilize the word salary because it's about, well, that's a part of it. It's more about the structure itself.
Okay, so perhaps motion to charge the exempt, charge or direct, motion to charge or authorize, perhaps authorize, or charge. Motion to charge the exempt level increase committee to draft an additional letter regarding the executive officer exempt level increase.
Correct.
That, after approval by the board, can be used in board committee member conversations with employees of the Department of Consumer Affairs, the California Business Consumer Services and Housing Agency, the California Department of Human Resources, and with the board members appointing authorities.
Because I don't want the motion to restrict conversations with potential relevant individuals, are any of the people that this could be presented to, would they be appointees as opposed to employees?
Yes,
So,
that's a good call.
so if we should, just to make sure that we're covering everything potential, employees and appointees of the list of agencies.
Okay. Employees or appointees. And I think you make a fair point that, there could be numerous things you can call someone, a representative, an agent, an employee, a appointee. We may just want to, I might recommend taking out a reference altogether and just say conversations with the Department of Consumer Affairs, the California Business and Consumer Services and Housing Agency, the California Department of Human Resources, and with the board's members appointing authorities, and not refer to employees or otherwise.
And chances are conversations probably won't happen until after the December meeting. And so I think at that point we can revisit it and maybe add.
They could not.
We could not.
You couldn't, the conversations could not happen
Could
until
not happen.
after the board was appointed, the committee was appointed, that delegation, by the full panel of board members.
So,
And the board has to review and approve the letter, approve that is going to be used in those conversations as the
Yes.
supporting
Mm-hmm.
base, yeah.
I guess what I'm getting at is, if in December we identify other stakeholders that might be of benefit for the committee to speak to, I'd like to be able to add that in at that time.
And I think you could at that point.
Yeah, so I think we can leave this as is and revisit it maybe in December.
It could say, the motion could say something like, with relevant stakeholders to be identified by the board.
Yeah, or we could leave it and just change it.
I don't know that it's necessary to make that clarity, because at this point, you're just speaking to the intent of the letter that's being drafted. Once it comes to the panel for full vote, the panel will have an opportunity to make additions and those kind of things.
Okay. So, any other board discussion about it? And is there a second?
I think just for the record is not very clear. I've recommended modified motion language, but it hasn't been adopted by Dr. Drummer. So, I guess I'm asking for that clarification for the record about whether the proposed motion language is the motion on the floor.
I would recommend to simplify and to just take, Sawa's addition that it's just to identify the Department of Consumer Affairs as an entity, Business Consumer Services and Housing Agency, California HR, and then the board members appointing authorities. So it's not necessary to say employees or appointees.
Dr. Drummer, any comment on the motion as it is?
If somebody has a revised draft of what the motion currently stands as, I would appreciate that.
Okay. So
I think that I've been keeping up, but I'm not definite, so.
I apologize. It's a work in progress, but have your assistance to help modify it. But what I currently have is motion to authorize the exempt level increase committee to draft an additional letter regarding the executive officer exempt level increase that, after approval by the board, can be used in board committee member conversations with the Department of Consumer Affairs, the California Business Consumer Services and Housing Agency, the California Department of Human Resources, and with the board members appointing authorities.
Instead of the board member, because if we leave it at board members, then it includes all of the board members. I would want to not want it to say the committees appointing authority or the committee members appointing authorities, because then we're losing one person with our current structure of the committee. So I think that if we leave it as board members appointing, I think that we're okay then.
Okay.
So moved.
I'll second.
Motion by Dr. Drummer and second by Dr. Dominguez. Any further board comment? And we invite public comment. And a roll call vote, please.
Alicia Benet-Men,
Aye.
TJ Watkins,
Aye.
Jesus Dominguez,
Aye.
Daniel Drummer,
Aye.
Katarina Ellaby,
Aye.
Tanya McMillian,
Aye.
6-0, motion carried.
With thank you in advance to our new committee members for the hard work they're about to accomplish.
I second. So just to clarify, our committee members consist of Katarina Ellaby and TJ Watkins. Yes. Hearing a request for a recess. It's 10:31, and we will reconvene at 10:40. Okay. Okay, we're back on record, and it is 10:45, and we are at agenda item number 9. I'd like to introduce Joseph McKenna, Deputy Attorney General, and the board's liaison to the Attorney General's office. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Joe McKenna. I'm a Deputy Attorney General in the Health Quality Enforcement section of the Attorney General's office. I'm also my section's liaison to the Physical Therapy Board. In the liaison role, I'm available to the executive officer and board staff to provide any counsel that the board may require for legal investigations, as well as any training, assisting, or leading at the request of the executive officer, as well as appearing at board meetings, among many of the functions I do. So we'll just jump right into it. For today, I've prepared a PowerPoint presentation. It is a basic introduction and just a general overview of the of the Attorney General's legal process for disciplinary actions before the Physical Therapy Board. I trust everybody has a copy. It looks like this. Okay. My presentations are interactive. Questions are invited, so please don't wait to the end. If you have any questions come up for you, just shoot, and I'll do my best to answer them as we go through this. All righty. One last question, Jason. Tell top, 12 o'clock button, that's what I think. Left and right. Oh, got it. All right. So the first, it'll probably be easier for you, I guess, if you thumb through your PowerPoint. This looks like it's a little bit slower. But those first 2 pages in your PowerPoint, if you look, you can thumb forward and backward. These are this is the Physical Therapy Act, all the articles contained in it, and it's all contained, as most of you know, in the Business and Professions Code. I'll just highlight Article 6. This is a section of the Practice Act that we rely upon mostly for prosecution of physical therapy board cases, and we'll discuss in greater detail a little bit later a lot of the sections that we rely upon. The next page, Article 7, the Substance Abuse Rehabilitation Program. This article is also a little bit, can we get a little bit brighter light? I'm sorry. I have some notes I have trouble reading here.
It goes like 2.
Oh, okay.
1 second.
All right.
You can adjust that.
I'm sorry, it's too bright for everybody. But this article is another key section that you'll frequently see involved in physical therapy board cases. That's Article 7. And most commonly, you'll see it in stipulated settlements involving licensees who've been convicted of a DUI and or have some other alcohol or drug involved type offense. Now, the Office of the Attorney General assists the board carry out its mandated function of discipline. Business and Professions Code Section 2605 says the board shall do all of the following. Most importantly, from prosecutor's eyes, is suspend and revoke licenses and otherwise enforce the provisions of this chapter, which is the key part. This is the Physical Therapy Board's business end for discipline by where HQE becomes involved with enforcement and the board fulfills its mandatory duties to protect the public. Now, today's topics, I just want to cover just briefly. We're not going to go into great detail, again, unless someone has a question, please don't hesitate to ask. We'll cover applicable law, the disciplinary process, and lastly, the Attorney General's, the Attorney General's annual report, which was filed this year on January 1st, 2018. I'll just essentially, it's a report containing statistics for a number of allied healthcare agencies, accusation matters, all 38 throughout the state, including the Physical Therapy Board. And I've excerpted information specifically applying to the Physical Therapy Board. We can cover that last. Okay. Business and Professions Code Section 2602, probably the most important section from an enforcement prosecutor's point of view. Now, protection of the public shall be the highest priority of the Physical Therapy Board in exercising its mandatory duties. Whenever the protection of the public is inconsistent with other interests sought to be promoted, the protection of the public shall be paramount. So I think as is understood just in listening to the discussion earlier, the board's highest priority always has been and will remain is public safety. Public safety comes first. And oftentimes with a lot of these cases, they're very difficult to balance because of the types of cases that we get involving physical therapists and the type of conduct that's alleged and we learn about in the investigations. But one thing's for certain is that the public interest outweighs the licensee's interest when these matters conflict. It's a balance test, and it's always a careful consideration where the board is deciding in particular types of cases, which is essentially to take away a licensee's ability to practice. For example, whether they revoke or suspend a license or deny an applicant a license altogether in which case we'll talk about that a little bit later, but an applicant may file a statement of issues. But what's essentially the board is saying is they're denying you the opportunity to obtain a physical therapist license. And in these situations, it's this balance test where the board must determine if the public interest outweighs the licensee or the applicant's interest.
So I have a question about
Yes, sir.
So that is just is that absolutely just a legal test? That balance test is the legal test. So it's going to be on the actual legal position of the licensee versus the legal interest of the public. You see what I'm getting at sometimes I just want to use real life examples without mentioning cases. When you come across those things, it is very conceptual. And until you do a real case, and then when you do the real case, you see, oh, this could not be proven, this could be proven, this could not be proven, this could not be proven. But the overall deal is that if I err a year on the side, I want to err on the side of public protection, right?
Yes.
What our mandate is. And sometimes I'm just questioning, sometimes it's a lot closer to court. And so I'm interested in, say, sometimes when you review a case, just practically, where do you draw that line? Is it just, okay, this is the legal, this is what we could prove, not prove, and so on?
It's a great observation, more so than a question, but because it's an observation and it's something that every DAG goes through when a case is sent to our office. The first thing we do is determine whether or not there's legal sufficiency to file an accusation, because you want to do that very carefully. It's a very powerful tool, and we don't want to accuse anybody of something unless we have not just evidence, but sufficient evidence, admissible evidence, whether testimonial or documentary evidence, that we could prove the allegations. And it's an ethical decision made with every prosecutor. It's not one that's subject to board review, although the board maintains ultimate decision-making on whether or not to file an accusation. If the case is in our office, rest assured you have a trained prosecutor looking at whether or not the allegations coming to us from whether or not it's something from an expert report or it's a conviction case, that if we file that case, there is legal sufficiency. That then shifts the analysis more into the board's domain, whether or not this is an individual that should either not be given a license because of something in their past, or they're currently a licensee and there's conduct there that is very concerning. And it is closer calls, and I don't think it's one, in my experience, that's subject to standards. Like, one DUI means a person is unsafe to practice. Even 2 DUIs, alcohol and drug addiction is looked at as mental impairment, and it's an addiction, and it can be treated. But it's a case-by-case basis. I'm sorry, it's not a great answer, but rest assured that if we're at the point of filing an accusation, the legal standard that we could prove this case upon, the evidentiary burden that we carry, clear and convincing evidence, it can be met. Yes, sir.
Just carry that to the next level, the next step that we often see on the board is the stipulated decision or stipulated agreements. And the DAG, along with our executive officer, have significant conversation about what we could get to with what we think the licensee should be constrained, and then the licensee or their attorney working to try to get to an agreement. And so there's a challenge there sometimes with what is achieved there versus what potentially could be a decision of the board, which is different. So what contributes to that decision about getting to an agreement?
Well, we certainly have the roadmap, which are the disciplinary guidelines. So, everything must be filtered through the disciplinary guidelines. But it doesn't always work on all fours. For example, you may have cases where a licensee has submitted significant mitigation material. They've done something to correct the bad past conduct. And it does involve a significant amount of discussion between our office with the executive officer, and we relay a lot of the information that we get, oftentimes if the licensee is pro per or with the attorney, and we try to do our best to give our client, the executive officer, the physical therapy board, the best information to determine which probation conditions should be imposed if probation is to be offered. And if we feel that, and we certainly have a voice in this as a prosecutor, we definitely make a judgment. And I think for the most part, we do definitely lean towards very conservative approach on whether or not to give this person their license back. But we have to feel very comfortable that the probation conditions will remedy that. And I think that's sort of the relationship that works back and forth. And if we don't think that the probation conditions will work, we just won't offer probation. Is that?
And I believe part of the decision to be able to even go towards a step is the nature of the offense, the severity, et cetera, as to whether or
Correct.
Whether or not you, with the executive officer, would even consider a stipulated agreement versus no, this has to go to hearing. Is that correct?
Absolutely. Yes, some are just non-starters. And, oftentimes we'll take things out of order. And as I get there, but this is fine. In a lot of the cases that we have with physical therapy board respondents, they're pro per. And they have their own costs that they're going. If they're going to want to have their day in court, they're going to have to, pay that bill. And then also they're on the hook if at the end of it they lose, and there's investigation costs, and there's the cost for the time of the Attorney General's office, cost recovery. And so that can be significant, and that can really dissuade people from wanting to fight and not accept probation conditions that initially they will tell us that are onerous, and they can't do that. It's a dance that happens. So now let's see. I got a little sidetracked here. That's okay. No.
That's good. Thank you.
The applicable law. This is the code section we spend most of our time with, and that's 2660. And this is the charging section most frequently used in physical therapy board cases. And it deals with unprofessional conduct, and it includes a number of subsections, including gross negligence and repeated negligent acts. In looking at the section, unprofessional conduct will constitute grounds for a citation, discipline, denial of a license, or issuance of a probationary license, again, in the example of someone coming to the profession for the first time. I want to note, and this is just something interesting, is that unprofessional conduct in the Practice Act, the Physical Therapy Practice Act, is not limited just to the sections in 2660. It's important to note that. The Practice Act has adopted and incorporates the Medical Practice Act. And a violation of the Medical Practice Act in certain instances can and are alleged in physical therapy board cases. And I'll discuss it a little bit later, but typically it's involved with DUIs or any sort of cases involving drugs and alcohol. I'll discuss that a little bit later. But it gives us more reach to impose discipline in cases.
Mr. McKenna?
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about suspending a license? I mean, there's probably a reason why we don't see it as much as a board. I don't know if that's something that's usually, if it's going to happen, it's taken care of by our executive officer, or it's just something we don't usually use.
That's a good question. Is that something, Jason, you want to address?
Sure.
If you kind of think back to the general nature of a disciplinary order, and the kind of general philosophy behind it, that the order is a protection order for the public, and that within that order it should never be considered punitive or punishment for the licensee. You're building an order to which that you can allow them to practice within their scope with certain conditions in a measure to keep the public safe. Typically, when we would use suspension is when we've identified that in this particular circumstance with this licensee, that there's some kind of remediation that needs to occur. Maybe an educational course or an evaluation by a psychiatrist or an anger management counselor or something like that, for us to be able to determine that additional step that they are safe to practice. And so in those situations, we'll suspend that licensee for that period of time. And again, it's not punitive. We're not doing it in a punishment fashion. We're doing it because for us to make the decision whether or not they're safe to practice, we need that assessment, or we've determined as a board that we need that education to be remediated. So you don't see it very often. In situations, the best example probably is when you deal with alcohol or drug-related charges, and there's that period in the disciplinary order for 30 days where they have to be assessed and they can't return to work until after that's done. That 30 days is really, it falls under that guise. We need those things to happen before we can let them to return to work. They have to fulfill, the assessment or the clinical diagnostic evaluation. There may be some education courses that we require in there. They have to find a supervising physical therapist, and that supervising physical therapist has to be vetted by the board to make sure that they're appropriate. Maybe a work site monitor in those kind of situations. So the suspension is a period of time to allow those things to happen before we allow them to return back to practice. Again, not punitive, but simply to ensure that the public is protected.
Just want to go over a few vocab words, some basic definitions. Discipline, we just touched on that. What is discipline, what's not discipline, but the board should be aware that all of the disciplinary guidelines just refer to the guidelines for issuing citations and imposing discipline. Again, that's what we refer to. All prosecutors have a copy of that, so when we're getting the case and we've reviewed the evidence and we see the expert report and what are the charges, we begin to find out what should the offer be in this case, if in fact there should be an offer, the probation terms. And again, it can include imposition of terms of probation or outright revocation if there's just simply can't be an offer. And again, that will encapsulate a lot of conversation between my office with the executive officer, and initially it results in an offer to the licensee. Discipline is not a citation, and I think Mr. Kaiser touched on this. It's also an action under Business Professions Code Section 820 for impairment. If somebody is identified as having a mental or physical impairment, and I'll address this a little bit more detail later, but just suffice it to say, if they are going to have a license suspended due to that, it is not considered discipline. The executive officer, again, complainant in the majority of our cases, statement of issues, accusation, and petition to revoke probation all get reviewed by the executive officer prior to filing. This next slide, very detailed. I included a specific case. We can certainly read it at your leisure, but it's an accounting board case dealing with discipline of an accountant by the State Board of Accountancy, where the board found the conduct substantially related to the qualifications, functions, or duties of the accounting profession. It's not a physical therapy board case, obviously, but the concept, the legal concept, applies to all cases, including physical therapy board cases, that for purposes of showing how broadly this conduct for physical therapists, is often grounds for discipline, even when conduct does not involve direct patient care. And oftentimes it's a difficult conversation to have initially when the example may be a DUI, or again, we see this a lot in drug and alcohol-related conduct, and it does not involve a patient. But it has already been legally determined that, for example, DUIs, that is substantially related to the practice of physical therapy. It's not a conversation. that you have with the accused, with the licensee. So it doesn't involve direct patient care, but it's been deemed substantially related. There are a number of other types of conduct that have been determined to be substantially related, and we'll touch on that. I just want to also touch on the evidentiary standards. I'm sorry. And go to that next slide. This next slide shows the qualifications, functions, and duties. Again, this is more specifically the subsection within 2660, conviction of a crime that's been determined to be substantially related to the practice of physical therapy. Burden of proof. The party who must prove the facts and the law to the requisite degree carries the burden of proof, which is usually the board. But in a short number of circumstances, it would be the applicant, for example, in a petition for reinstatement or a statement of issues. The standard of proof that we operate with is clear and convincing evidence, which is, by definition, evidence being presented must be highly and substantially more probable to be true rather than untrue. The trier of fact needs to have a complete belief of the factuality of the evidence presented. Clear and convincing evidence is a very high standard. It is just below the legal standard beyond a reasonable doubt, which is required in criminal courts for a conviction. So again, I can't underemphasize. It's a sufficient burden that we do carry in our cases. And again, going back to when we evaluate cases, we're thinking not just whether or not this conduct appears to be a violation, is can we take the evidence all the way through the completion of a hearing and meet that standard. So when we do file accusations, we've already gone through that, made that final decision. The next slide deals with pre-licensure circumstances, statement of issues. Again, we've touched on this a little bit, I believe, but an application for licensure may result in the issuance of an unrestricted license. That's if there's no issues with this particular applicant, or issuance of a restricted license because probation is deemed necessary, or an outright denial of a license. And if that's the case, the licensee will have that opportunity to object and ultimately get in front of an administrative law judge with a statement of issues after that is filed. Important to note a couple things. The burden will be on the applicant as to why they should be admitted to the profession of physical therapy. Another thing to also keep in mind is cost recovery in statement of issue cases is not part of any final resolution or adjudication of the matter. There is no cost recovery when it comes to statement of issues. It's the one proceeding with which it doesn't, the licensee will not be required to pay for our costs, even though we will be involved. Post-licensure. Now, when we get a reported violation of the Physical Therapy Act, an investigation is initiated, and if violations are found, we will file an accusation, which can, as discussed, result in probation terms being imposed or outright revocation. If we go to hearing, a judge does have that option to revoke a license or place the license on probation. Now, if a license is placed on probation, as some of you know, a licensee will have a set determined number of years to complete probation. In some instances, probation will be revoked where probation conditions were not met. And if that is the case, the burden of proof will be on the board to prove a probation violation. However, the evidentiary standard will not be the same. It will no longer be clear and convincing evidence. It will be a preponderance of the evidence. And I guess a good way to envision that is sort of the two even scales. The weight of a feather tipping a scale slightly more will be the required amount of evidence that we would need to show that we have a probation violation in a particular case. So definitely when you have good evidence of a probation violation, it's not too difficult to prove when we have to go to court. This next slide discusses gross negligence or repeated acts of negligence. I won't go through this in too much detail here, but the standard of care we get from our experts, and the standard of care that a reasonable, prudent practitioner would provide under the same or similar circumstances. And typically in our expert reports, as prosecutors, we're reviewing that when we're looking at the evidence. And it's very important for us to understand that through the expert report, which helps shape whether or not the expert found gross negligence or simple negligence. And the definitions there for you to look at: gross negligence is the want of even scant care, and simple negligence is looked at as a lesser departure from the standard of care. Did you have a question, sir? Oh, okay.
I do.
Okay, yes.
I don't really see simple negligence too much. Do we see it?
So most instances of simple negligence would probably be handled at the citation level. And so simple negligence rises to discipline when it's a collection of simple negligence, repeated acts. And so you have seen in documentation simple negligence stated, but the overall negligence is titled gross or repeated acts because there's a collection of multiple simple negligence allegations.
And we sometimes might see it referred to as a departure as opposed to referred to as negligence. So, you know, just as a departure from the standard of care, a gross departure from the standard of care, but usually that's what we're kind of talking about.
Sexual misconduct. A finding of sexual misconduct or attempted misconduct, sexual misconduct, has very serious repercussions and essentially results in the revocation of a license. And I've listed 3 sections down below which, if present if present and found during an investigation, there is no discretion, an order shall contain the language which revokes the license. In those 3 situations are listed there, and that's any offense for which Penal Code Section 290 registration is required, or a finding that the offense was committed. So that doesn't necessarily mean that when the case is in our office that we have to prove a conviction, because oftentimes we may not have a conviction. There's any number of reasons why investigations don't complete themselves. But that doesn't mean that the investigation on the board side has to come to an end as well. We can go forward, and we often do. Number 2 is an offense defined in specific penal code sections, or a finding, again, that that act was committed, or an attempt to commit such an offense. So the code sections give us a lot of authority here because, again, the nature of the conduct is so serious. It's at the most dangerous to the public, and so we have a lot of ability to prosecute conduct through this code section. Incompetency is different from negligence. So this is sort of a curious charge here. Oftentimes, you like to think your practitioners, if they made a mistake, they made a mistake because, they had a bad Tuesday or something. But incompetence is not negligence. It's the absence of understanding. It's a total absence of qualification, ability, or fitness to perform the prescribed duties or functions. And this becomes a particular issue when you want to balance protection of the public, which is particularly high in these types of cases because you have evidence that the physical therapist or the physical therapist assistant appears to have no training. And so how do you balance protection here? And so the consideration is, well, retraining. But again, it's something that has to be looked at very closely when it isn't just negligence, because it's just this concern that this person just has an entire gap of understanding on what they're supposed to be doing. Next section deals with 820 evaluations. And under Business Profession Code 820, an order for a mental and physical exam can be ordered. The board has the power to do that. And if it is determined that there is a possibility there's a licensee that's unable to practice safely due to a mental illness or a physical illness, they have the power to order an evaluation, and that can be done through a physician, a surgeon, or a psychiatrist, psychologist. That report, if at a later hearing, which occurs, that can be made admissible, or that's available to the licentiate, but it's also direct evidence at a later hearing to determine whether or not this person is safe to practice. And a failure to comply with the order, one thing I want to note, by the licensee to comply with the order from the board can result in, or can constitute grounds for suspension or revocation immediately.
Can you repeat that, please?
Yes, when the board has determined that they're going to issue an order or a request for an evaluation, that a licensee's failure to comply with that can result in their suspension or revocation of their license immediately. And essentially, because again, the balance test, we have somebody who we think may be we have good suspicion that this person is a danger to the public, and we need an evaluation to, determine that. But if they're unwilling to come forward and cooperate, then we need a very, draconian measure, which is to suspend them, take their ability to practice away.
So it can constitute grounds. This says it shall. But it can and it cannot.
I'm sorry, I misspoke. It shall constitute. I misspoke.
So in all cases, if we order a mental evaluation or psychiatric evaluation, that license
Shall
shall
comply.
be revoked or suspended.
That is correct. Was there a question in the back? Yes.
And so, that's a decision that has to be made by the board, or can that be made by the executive officer on behalf of the board?
It's made by the executive officer, but I'll let Jason address that.
Yeah, that authority is delegated to the complainant in the matter. And the shall for an 820 very rarely happens, but I think there's a word of caution in that, is that if an 820 request is being made, that you have a reasonable argument to request the 820. It has to be something that you have a concern with their physical ability or their mental ability to perform under that scope of practice, and that if they can't, that would be a danger to the public, right? So if you don't have those elements, you wouldn't order it. And then in ordering that 820, they have a right to appeal to it. But ultimately, if they don't comply with the 820 request, the board has no further recourse other than to either suspend or revoke.
But it is the board that is required to submit the 820. The board has to request the 820. Is the board action?
The executive officer would request the 820.
Does the board have to adopt that request?
No, but you would receive that the result of that 820 inspection in either that it was complied with or it wasn't complied with. If it is complied with, you would receive the results of that examination, and they would either be considered, evidentiary mitigation for the respondent or aggravation for the board, right? The evidence is what it is. If it comes back clean, then it's to the benefit of the respondent.
So the board, the executive officer simply should then inform the board that a mental and physical exam have been requested.
Correct.
Under B&B 820
It'll
of
be,
an individual.
it would be very obvious in the accusation that you receive that the 820 was ordered and completed, or it was ordered and it was denied, which then an additional charge of a violation of 820 would also be in that accusation.
But just for the order of 820, the board wouldn't necessarily have to be involved.
No.
The next slide, titled Uniform Standards Related to Substance Abuse and Disciplinary Guidelines. This deals with cases, most frequently when we're dealing with DUIs, alcohol involved cases, where probation conditions are spelled out in these guidelines, and they're mandatory, they need to be imposed, and they can be quite onerous. I'll just give a couple anecdotes in some physical therapy board cases I've had in the past with licensees who were alcoholics, and they just were not at a point where they're able to deal with their addiction. And once, after working with Mr. Kaiser and putting together a probation offer and imposing these conditions, it's quite onerous. It became apparent in these two different cases that they weren't going to be able to meet their burden. Because we're talking about mandatory biological fluid testing, psychiatric counseling, AA, all sorts of things. If you can get through this, you're doing well. And they just decided to give up because they did not believe in themselves that they'd be able to get through this program. So, it's very difficult. So it's a very good probation condition that we have and that we often deal with. All right. The next slide, this is part 2, and I'll try and run through this. This is the disciplinary process, basically the overview of the life of a case. And, I'm sorry, I'm not very adept at this here. Okay, this is all coming up. Is there a way to get them all pop up?
You can advance through them quicker.
Yeah, okay, that's what I'm doing. In the interest of time here. Okay, that I did not want. Okay. A complaint is received. It can either be an internal complaint, a crime, for example. Some of you may know that courts have mandatory duties to inform licensing agencies. So, for example, if you have a physical therapist who gets a conviction, you'll have a court clerk in some county sending up to the medical board, hey, this person was convicted. And it begins this whole process. And that's how, and then ultimately we'll get pulled in as the Attorney General's office and we'll begin a conviction case. Other ways of receiving external complaints from consumers. And it'll trigger an investigation. Ultimately, it'll get referred to us for evaluation if the board believes it should be transmitted. We'll file an accusation, and the rest are the potential results from adjudication. Finally, court review if elected. So if after the board has reviewed everything and made its final decision, the respondent is still unhappy about that, they can choose to writ the board's final decision, and these matters would be filed and heard in Superior Court.
An individual self-reports as they're required to by
Yes.
the Practice Act. Does that fall under item 1 as well? That it's not really a complaint received, but it's a report of the arrest or of the conviction?
Well, that's an interesting question. Certainly, the model presumes that we're always going to get information from the courts, and certainly it doesn't happen because I've had a case where I found a second DUI and we didn't know about that. But if they come forward and, as they should according to the Practice Act, and I'm not sure, is it 30 or 60 days that they have to inform
30.
the board? 30 days. That will certainly trigger an investigation. The next case, these are just some samples of cases that highlight what we discussed a little bit earlier, the substantial relationship, Eisenberg v. Myers, dishonesty in billing. You cannot compartmentalize dishonesty. It is substantially related to the practice of physical therapy. Another case, Hughes v. Board of Architecture. Whether it's lying, dishonesty, or corruption, notwithstanding it's not related to patient care or direct patient care, if you have that in these cases, in the investigations involving physical therapists, it will be alleged as being substantially related, and it is a violation of the Practice Act, no question. This last slide I'll talk a little bit about because it's where we get a lot of activity because it involves alcohol-involved offenses. Griffiths v. Superior Court was a case involving a licensee, a physician who was convicted of a DUI and fought back and ultimately lost. Basically, the court said, nope, being convicted of a DUI is substantially related to the training, to being a physician, to the practice of medicine. And the same holds true for physical therapy. There is a nexus between DUI convictions and practice of physical therapy. It's not open to discussion. We get that a lot from licensees, like, hey, this had nothing to do with me dealing with patients. It's like, well, I'm sorry, but it's the law. And no patient harm needs to be shown either. That just obviously is part and parcel of the approach, the analysis. A case came down after Griffiths, which expanded it, and that case was Watson. And Griffiths dealt with a DUI conviction, but what Watson says is it's not necessary. You don't need a conviction. You can just show the conduct. And again, there are many reasons why you may not have a DUI conviction, but you can have evidence of abusing alcohol, and you can have an arrest. There's a number of reasons that you might not have a conviction. And this would be an instance where, in a physical therapy case, I would go outside the Practice Act and utilize a code section from the Medical Practice Act, and that's 2239A. 2239A has to deal with where a licensee uses alcohol or drugs to an extent where it's injurious to themselves or others. It doesn't need a conviction. So, for example, I have a case where a physician was arrested and blew a .18 2 times. A blood was a 2.0, and got a really, really good deal. The case went away. And so I have a police report. I have a police officer. I get that certified. I can call the police officer to trial if I need to go to trial. I have a lab packet that shows the chemical test, the blood test. I have that person come in, and that's how, as a prosecutor, I'd put that case on. But I don't have a conviction. But what I do have is a licensee who has potential signs of alcoholism and is dangerous. And that's what 2239A permits us to do, because I don't need a conviction. And again, we use this in physical therapy board cases. And again, it gives us more reach as prosecutors to protect the public, in fact. The next slide Arneson v. Fox, and it's 2 cases actually, and it talks to basically, in regard to criminal cases, if a licensee enters a plea of no contest, the board can treat that plea as a guilty plea. It doesn't matter. But in civil cases, there's a privilege. The privilege that exists in criminal cases against self-incrimination, is not the same standard in a civil action. So the absolute privilege that exists in a criminal case does not exist in a civil case. A witness or party may be required either to waive that privilege at a hearing in an administrative setting, or accept the civil consequences of silence if they choose not to testify, which they're required to do. So in this situation, an ALJ can make a negative finding in cases where a licensee does in fact refuse to testify at their own hearing. And that certainly benefits the complainant, and it damages the credibility of the respondent. So just to recap, why is discipline imposed for acts committed outside of patient treatment? Well, there's a lot of conduct, a lot of activity that exists that certainly would pose dangers to public safety, but don't involve direct care, and they're up there, prevention of fraud and deceit, and other matters, moral turpitude, including fraud. And then finally, I just want to briefly cover this. I think it'd be of interest to everyone here. It is a Attorney General annual report that was prepared and filed at the beginning of this year. It's the first of its kind. It was filed January 1st, 2018. And it is the report itself is a summary of a lot of data involving accusation referrals from the 38 different allied health agencies, which also includes the Physical Therapy Board. So the Attorney General's office compiled a lot of data and put it together for these 30 different agencies. I've excerpted some of the information, including just the executive summary and touching on investigation processes that I thought might be interesting to the board to sort of have like a 30,000-foot view. And then I have at the very end a table, and I'll get to that just in a second. But one thing I just thought I would point out is that the approach to investigation process is not the same for all these different agencies throughout DCA. And if you look 2 slides, I can't see the number, let's see. There you go. I'm not sure what slide number that is, but it's halfway down investigation process. This is a paragraph, again, that I excerpted out of a much larger report. But agencies differ in how they investigate their cases. They generally assign investigation of their cases in 4 different ways, and I'll just kind of cover them for you. Most commonly, agencies will investigate their cases using their own staff, their own resources. Others will, with certain types of cases, certain classes of cases, they will use investigation assistance from the Division of Investigations. A third model is known as vertical enforcement, requires a Deputy Attorney General like myself to participate and work with an investigator in the investigation and the ultimate decision to transmit the case. So there's a lot of hand-in-hand work between a Deputy Attorney General and an investigator when you use this model. And then finally, the decision, very frequently modeled, one that I think the Physical Therapy Board utilizes through the liaison, is using a liaison deputy to consult and assist on different types of cases, whether pending accusations or investigations, or even other bigger issues that are sort of, for example, the corporate practice of medicine, unlicensed corporate practice of medicine. There may be cases that we don't quite have in the pipeline yet, but there are issues where a liaison or another DAG can assist the board at a sort of a quasi-investigation. And that's another method that we try and assist the board. And the next 2, I will just skip over because I wanted to get to that last section before we break. And that's the very last page is a table that I excerpted out of, again, this report, and it deals specifically with the data for the Physical Therapy Board. Again, this was the first report of its kind filed this year. The data that it looked at was for fiscal year 2016-2017. And what you have in front of you is the number of accusations that were referred to our office. As you can see, that was 33. There was only 1 that was rejected for filing. So it's statistically, it's really good. Essentially, I don't know that particular case, but there might have been problems with the case, problems with the evidence. But for the most part, everything that gets sent to us, we file on. Occasionally, we'll ask for more investigation, and we'll get it if we need it. Information, for example, if it's a DUI or a drug type case, we may need additional reports or lab reports, and we'll just call the board and ask for that. And that would be come under a category of requesting additional investigation. We filed 24. 0 accusations were withdrawn, which it does happen. I've seen it happen, but fortunately we did not have that happen. The matters adjudicated were 20 during the fiscal year. 4 perhaps were still pending at the time. So, but that presents the data for the fiscal year 2016-2017, which gives you sort of an idea of what's going on activity-wise between our 2 offices, between the board and our office. So, sorry that was a lot of data and information, and if something I can answer, please ask.
Will the discrepancy between number 3 and 4 also be possibly pending cases, or could it be from another reason?
So the board okay, let's see. Some of the matters, I can't speak intelligently to all possibilities, but if a case required further investigation, I'm not sure if something took place at the board. Perhaps we did not get the additional information, or a decision was later made that we were still able to go forward. I didn't touch on this before, I guess, backing up to ethical duties to review pleadings. We get an expert report. Allegations are, put forward, or departures are said, hey, these are possible causes for discipline. We may not see everything in there, and so we may allege an accusation that doesn't contain or, in fact, has more violations. It just depends on the evaluation. And so we may not always get the investigation that we think would help make the best possible case, but it doesn't mean that we don't have enough to go forward. And sometimes, given statute of limitation type issues, we don't have a choice, and so we file the case. So, yeah.
Joe, would a good example of number 4 be a case that is already at the accusation level, but a subsequent arrest comes in on that same respondent and it has to be amended?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And also one other consideration we have to make, and we have to always touch base and actually be very constant contact with statute of limitation cases, where you have a criminal conviction case, or you have a criminal case, and the district attorney or the city attorney is moving at their own rate in the criminal case, and we prefer to hang back and let the criminal case be adjudicated, because then we can come in, and we would love to always have convictions. It makes it so much easier. But that's not always the case. And sometimes, in certain circumstances, if you have to get out in front of the criminal case and file a case, you have to do that, because if the statute's going to run, it's going to run, and we'll lose that opportunity. So that can be a situation where the numbers don't always reflect. If there are no further questions, I'm done boring your ears off here.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
So we'll take a 5-minute break. We can get the equipment situated and move on to our next agenda item.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, we're back on record. It's 11:47, and we're going to pick up with agenda item number 7, 7B, Department of Consumer Affairs reports.
Just a point of order, did we request, public comment on the last agenda item?
We sure didn't. So finishing up with agenda item number 9, the overview of Attorney General's legal process for disciplinary actions. Is there any public comment on that? Thank you. Ms. Nelson, you're welcome to stay seated. Okay, agenda item number 7B.
Good morning, everyone. President Robina Ahmed, Vice President Watkins, Executive Officer Kaiser, board members. Great to see you all again. Sorry I missed the last meeting, but I do believe Mr. Kaiser provided our update on behalf of the department. Thank you again for allowing us an opportunity to provide a brief update specific to recent activities to your board. The first thing I'd like to update you on is the director's teleconference and the quarterly meeting. On June 25th, the director hosted his first board member and advisory committee leadership teleconference. We had over 30 participants in that call, which included board presidents, vice presidents, chairs, vice chairs, as well as some advisory committee members. And during that call, DCA provided updates on pro rata, Assembly Bill 2138, and some regulatory process improvements. Wanted to thank the board leadership for participating in that call, and we do hope that you found that information valuable. With the initial success of that teleconference, we do plan to host another one before the end of the calendar year, potentially in December, and please be on the lookout for that meeting notice, and we look forward to your participation again. Last month, on August 6th, the director's quarterly meeting included presentations from the Department of General Services, DCA's Equal Employment Opportunity Office, and DCA's Office of Human Resources. DGS previewed their plan for their new construction that will house DCA in 2024. I think Executive Officer Kaiser alluded to that earlier in his presentation. The Employment Opportunity Office provided a primer on implicit bias, and the Office of Human Resources shared some new innovations and improvements on HR processes specific to recruitment and adverse actions. The next quarterly meeting is scheduled for October 29th. On our licensing and enforcement work groups, we do continue to meet monthly and to discuss specific topics and innovate in areas of licensing and enforcement, as you all know, whether through efficiencies in business processes or program collaboration. This last month, the licensing work group discussed a tool for streamlining letter generation through the Quality Business Intelligence Reporting Tool, also known as QBERT. This tool is currently available to Breeze programs, and I do believe that your board utilizes it frequently. And I wanted to acknowledge Mr. Vincent Azar, who I believe was in the audience earlier. We did feature PTBC as one that's really ahead, further along in utilizing this tool. And he did share some of his practices and some of the tools that he did develop for the board for reporting. So wanted to thank him for sharing his expertise and knowledge to different boards and bureaus. And per Executive Officer Kaiser, I do believe that lots of our boards and bureaus have been reaching out to the board to get some more help and assistance in that. So thank you to the board for continuing to send your licensing and enforcement staff to these meetings and contributing to the dialogue. Specific to DCA's leadership program, the Future Leadership Development Program kicked off the second cohort yesterday. DCA received 48 applications during the recruitment process, of which 7 were selected to participate in the program. We wanted to thank Executive Officer Kaiser, again, for his continued support of this program and participating in the steering committee. With regard to the Substance Abuse Coordination Committee, at its June meeting, the committee examined, as you know, Uniform Standard Number 4 and took an in-depth look at drug testing methodologies, research, and technological advancements. The committee heard from a panel of industry and medical experts in the field of rehabilitation, toxicology, and laboratory science. The committee voted to adopt some technical changes to Uniform Standard 4 and decided to further examine the issue of testing frequency at the next meeting scheduled for October 30th. And last but certainly not least, the board member orientation training wanted to congratulate Dr. Drummer and Dr. Dominguez for their recent reappointment to the board and wanted to remind you all of that requirement to complete within a year of appointment or reappointment to the board to attend one of these board member orientation trainings. There is one scheduled for the 18th, and the next one is December 5th. And once the 2019 dates are published, we will make sure you have those as well. And that concludes the department update for today.
Nice.
And if there's any, how the department can be of service to you, please let us know.
Thank you.
Any questions?
Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Any board questions for Ms. Nelson? So I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
I have a question. So the directors meeting with board member leadership, I participated in that, and that was a good thing and a good way to get questions out there and get questions answered. I did not on the phone actually ask questions, but we were allowed while presentations were being made to type in questions. And so I thought that was very effective, and the questions were answered. I was wondering if there will continue to be opportunities for board leadership, whether it's myself or anyone else on the board, to accompany our executive officer at a director's meeting in the future, if there's a reason why it was split, or if it's going to be, there's going to be an invitation to have those happen at the same time again.
So I do believe the intention was that there was one meeting annually that would include board leadership, and that was the one that was done, I believe it was first quarter. And so there will be another one annually. It's typically the first one, but we will make sure to let you know when that is, when it is a joint one.
Okay. Was there one in the beginning of the year, Mr. Kaiser?
That you and I attended.
There was one earlier this year that you and I attended?
In the very beginning of the year.
Okay.
I think it was in the latter part of January.
Okay, yeah, it just seems long ago.
I know.
I don't remember, it was this year. Is there a reason why DCA leadership would not want board leadership present with its executive officer at a director's meeting?
You know, I don't know. Prior to us coming on board, we were historically was told that it was one per year. I believe in other iterations it was together and then there was separate. I think we're taking a look at what would work best, and I'm happily able to provide that feedback and see if that's something we can take a look at for future.
That'd be great. Specifically, if you could give us an answer to why we would not be able to attend together.
Okay.
Since we serve together and work together, I'm just curious if there's a reason why DCA sees a benefit to separating us out.
I'm happy to look into that and
Yeah.
report back.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Yeah. Any further board comment?
Yeah, I was on that call too, and I was curious because there was so much conversation that I wanted to know, outside of engaging with everybody that's in the DCA board system, what was the objective? Is it to harness new ideas? Is it give a feel for what is happening in each of the boards? I kind of was making notes along the line. That's why I never typed it in, because I was kind to find out, are we going to do something with some of this information? That is what I was going for on that call.
So the intent on the call is to make sure that information is available to you and board leadership, and to ensure that the board is directly able to respond to any questions that may have occurred or may have asked during that time. But the intention is to ensure that the director is available to you directly. And that's also the intent of the quarterly director quarterly meetings as well.
I don't know that, for PTBC in particular, when we have a director's meeting with the executive officers, we have had ample opportunity in the past to involve either the president or the vice president. But I can remember and recall that that's not always necessarily the case for the other boards and bureaus, right? So while the executive officer might be in the room, they may not have a member representative there. And so maybe that meeting is set to accentuate that idea that their attendance this meeting is just for them. And maybe that generates that urgency that they actually do come. Our members are always very participatory and volunteer to come down and attend those things. But I think for those of you that have done it, sometimes your colleagues aren't in the room for whatever reason, their profession schedule doesn't allow for it or something like that. So I think siloing the information, that might be one of the benefits, is that we wanted, and in that one they had 30 representatives, and in even that regard there's 38, 39, no bureaus. Well, either way, they had a decent representation at that point. So,
Yeah. Any further board discussion? Any public comment? Thanks so much, Ms. Nelson.
Thank you.
Okay. Did you catch which one? Did you catch when they reconvened? 11:47, was it? Yeah. Okay, and agenda item number 8, administrative services. Is that where we are?
that's where we are, and we're going to start with staff introductions. Yeah.
Yeah.
There are 4 members of the admin staff in the room.
Sorry, unfortunately, there isn't us here today. I wish I did have Slade Toby, which is our cashier, to
provide a brief introduction today, but he's not here, and Araceli's on vacation, and you all are really very familiar with Araceli. She handles board relations. Liz Constancio, I manage the Administrative Services Program, and
April Beauchamp, I'm the new Communication and Education Analyst.
I'm Carl Nelson, and I'm the Business Services Liaison to DCA.
And how long have each of you been with the board?
oh, I'm so glad you asked. Just September 1st was 7 years for me with the board.
2 months.
15 years.
Brooke Arneson, I do legislation and regulation for the board. I've been here for about 4 years.
We wanted to make sure that there was an opportunity for the board members to put a face to a name for each and every member of the staff. It's hard to wrangle that number of people with vacations and those kind of things. So thank you.
Let us officially say thank you for all you do for PTBC. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, and then with that, we'll go into budget. We'll just stay up here.
Okay. For the budget report, I just wanted to make a few comments. The final quarter budget report is based on a month 11 projection received from the DCA budget office. As you know, the board budget staff is still waiting for a month 12 and a month 13 final report for 17-18 due to delays caused by the hardships in working with fiscal budgeting and accounting system. An actual end-of-year report's not available at this time. So as for our report, we took the month 11 and projected out our numbers.
And we included a memo from DCA in regards to the fiscal matter.
Do we project that year-end report will be ready by the December meeting? I know it's out of your hands, Carl.
It is out of my hands. I hope so.
Hopefully.
We are hopeful.
Yes.
I'm sitting over here trying to kind of calculate the odds in my head, and I'm not willing to bet.
So as of the month 11 report, we're projecting a reversion to the fund of $191,000. And then there were two line items I wanted to make quick comments on. The under general services, we have an insurance item, which traditionally has been very low, $20 for the entire fiscal year, and suddenly it showed up as $6,300 this year. And talked to Budget Office about that, and apparently it's not really, it's not an increase in an expenditure, but it's a change to where that number actually appears in the budget. So for transparency's sake, they decided to show insurance as its own item, whereas before it was scattered throughout some of the pro rata items. And then the other one was our consolidated data center line item, and that expenditure increased to $9,459 this year projected, and this is due to the board sharing costs for the technical support from California Office of Technology in changing over to Office 365. And that shows up negative. The budget for that line item is only $2,000. So in conclusion, the budget continues to revert money at the end of each fiscal year, despite setting aside $200,000 for moves. And I think this trend shows that the board is responsibly handling its fiscal affairs.
Carl, I have a question about the consolidated data center line item. Is that a one-time cost for Office 365, or is that like a subscription?
I think we're going to see about 3 years worth of costs from what I remember.
Okay, thank you.
but I do believe the initial cost is higher. So the maintenance years, you'll see that reduce a little bit. And I guess there's a term for that. It's, while it's pro rata, it's outside of the department. It's other state pro rata services.
That's why we don't have a budget as high as we would like to have for that item.
But having said that, in that line item in particular, that was money well spent. Office 365 has brought a lot of efficiencies for us from the day-to-day work.
And so have we seen not an identical corresponding decrease in other costs because of transitioning to Office 365?
Not identical, but I would say more. That's why I say money well spent, is that it was an investment that just the efficiencies created, not some of the technical difficulties we had in contract negotiations and having to move and always open new licenses for each new employee, created its own expense in administration. And now it's much easier to do, and it's much more mobile. If we have a computer and a laptop, it's included. And as for you and board members, you don't cost me as much money anymore. So I mean, switching to that system was a great benefit.
As long as our costs are not financial to you.
Yeah.
I'm good with that.
And just a reminder, Jason did bring up a good point. The cost initially will be a little higher than over the next 2 years. There's a 3-year span of the cost. And so going into the contract, we always estimate high and room for growth. But as we don't spend those monies, we won't have so much of a cost. So look for those adjustments down the road.
Any further board member comment? Any public comment? Thank you all so much. Is there?
We have outreach.
Yep.
Outreach. So for the website, the overall traffic for the fourth quarter, it decreased 11%. PTBC had 219,146 web hits throughout the homepage tabs compared to 245,007 this time last year. The law section did have the most significant decrease compared to last fiscal year this time, with a decrease of 36%. For the whole fiscal year, the website traffic decreased by 6%. Facebook, the overall traffic has increased by 147%. This quarter, 37,461 people accessed our page compared to 15,153 last fiscal year. The consumers had the most significant increase with the 845% increase, and then engaged users followed with 655% increase. In total, looking at the whole fiscal year, the traffic increased by 19%. And then the outreach events for the fiscal year, September through October, we visited Sac State 4 times. January, UOP was visited twice. February, we visited Fresno State. And then in March, there was a visit to Sac City, and then also student conclave at Mount St. Mary's. Thank you, Dr. Jesus Dominguez. And then in May, we visited Ohlone. For future outreach efforts, I'm currently working on an outreach calendar with more outreach events coming up, and I expect this fiscal year to make up in areas that have decreased. And then I'm also currently working with Jason and management on education efforts and doing more school presentations in the future. And we will continue to post more posts to Facebook to increase the traffic even more. And then with the Facebook traffic increasing, I think if we do more posts where we reference the website more, that'll also help the website increase as well. So like adding links saying, for more information, visit this page, and things like that will help with the website increase as well.
She has been doing an awesome job.
Thank
The
you.
transition was flawless.
April, if you could amend the report before we go to final draft for minutes to include the visits, the site visits that you described, because I'm not seeing those mentioned, and I think that would be a valuable thing to have
Absolutely.
documented for us.
The recap.
And then, Mr. Kaiser, with regard to the website, I know that the actual components of the website are not something that we have very good ability to influence ourselves, that we have to submit to others to have those things updated. In my recent exploration of trying to review laws and regs and trying to click through the links that are referring to Westlaw,
Mm-hmm.
and there's nothing there. And just because that's the first link, or that's the first thing that I just go to when I try to click on it. Then I remember, wait a minute, go back to the book, find the PDF document which has it all there. But it's very frustrating to get to what should be a page that ends up being a Westlaw error page.
Yeah.
And if we can push to have those revised, those links removed, or however we want to do it to get people directed more towards that, the compiled guide, I think that would be helpful.
We're continuing to kind of find a cure to that problem. One of the issues, though, is that, and you kind of said it best as the example, because of bias and knowledge that you had, you knew that if you ran into Westlaw as an issue, you can go back to the laws and regs book. The link to the Westlaw pages is an attempt to give the most current statutes and regulations, because even the book that you're referring to doesn't account for, in this case, it's minimal because there's Section 100 changes. We've had regulatory changes since that last publication. Westlaw and those error pages that you run into are usually a capture in time, right? Their servers are down or something like that. The links are correct. A day later, you can go back and it'll have the information that you were looking for. But we have had numerous reports, and we've experienced it ourselves, where the Westlaw pages go down. What we used to do is try to maintain a copy of that ourselves, but you kind of alluded to that too. Those changes that I would request of the webmaster, they take time, resources, that kind of thing. So the Westlaw was an attempt to simplify the situation and also provide the most recent information, but we're still looking at trying to solve that problem.
When the book, I don't remember the title of the book, but when the book was developed, I thought I remembered a discussion that it was going to be a living document that would be updated with time, and I'm not sure that I remember. I thought that it was going to be as things changed, as new regulation was adopted, but if it's not being adopted on an ongoing basis, is that the case? Or is there a plan for updating on a quarterly basis or something like that to update the book?
What we were looking at before was at least annually. And then with a calculation mixed in of on as necessary, right? So the Section 100 changes that I alluded to were changes in references and statutes that might not affect someone's interpretation or reading, but maybe their research into how a statute came to be, kind of thing. So we were saving that for the next draft, which is scheduled for the first quarter of 2019, which is convenient because at the first of the year we'll have potentially new statutes that take effect from this last legislative session. We also have some regulations that are in the works, and so there's some internal calculations that we have to do to say, do we want to go to print now because we know we're going to go to print first, and then shortly after, a month or 2 months later, we'll have some significant regulatory changes and we'll have to print again, right? So there is a little bit, but that's why I say at least annually.
Thank you for that.
What is a reasonable expectation as far as timeline goes when the board requests a change for the website, for that change to be made?
The guidance that we receive is 7 to 10 days in advance. And I've experienced turnaround as quick as same day. In fact, very recently we've had to make that request. And so on a priority situation, they'll take that into consideration and they'll do it. But for normal changes, 7 to 10 days, and that has to do with the amount of change being requested. If we, in Daniel's example of if we were trying to do multiple pages within legislation or regulation or something, it could take much longer. And those technicians that are also providing services for those web pages, their resources are being taken elsewhere from the Office of Information Services too, with things like Breeze and the existing legacy systems that are still up and running for other boards and bureaus like CAS and ATS and CATS. But they're also, and I learned a little bit about this yesterday, taking on a new, looking at the new projects for those boards that aren't on any of those, right? So we used to call them Release 3, where they were going to be the next people to come on to Breeze. Well, they're now having to think about maybe other software vendors and those kind of things. So the 7 to 10 days, it can be frustrating to say the least, but I could see why that expectation is what it is.
I think from time to time, we'll hear a stakeholder say that the website needs to be updated.
Mm-hmm.
The website needs to be updated. And I was under the impression that it really took months.
Well, it depends on what kind, that's why I said what kind of update we're talking about. So each of the tabs that you see across the top of the page, each one of those tabs we have ongoing projects with to update the tab, right? Anything inside of that tab and the things that we would like to have changed. And as a priority, as things come up, if there's just something that's simply misleading, we'll deal with it right now. But we have general redesigns for each tab that we have as staff put together. And then to add to that a little bit is we're moving to a new template. So we're slated as one of the first boards to go next for a whole new redesign, meaning not just content, but the way that the board moves from page to page and how it's navigated, and trying to adhere to better website ergonomics, simply put, and making that access to information a little bit easier for stakeholders. And I do get a lot of feedback about the website, and it's very difficult to discern information and filter it out. But at the same time, I also get a lot of positive feedback for our website. To our surprise, I think you might remember FSBPT had awarded California with the best physical therapy website in the United States, which to us and how critical we are of our own website was kind of surprising. But to put it in perspective, going back and looking at some of the other jurisdictions, if anything, our website's a little too thorough, right? There's so much information sometimes it's hard to get to what you're looking for because it's so crowded. Mm-hmm. So I think you'll see improvements in that regard when we switch to the new template and all of our existing project tabs are incorporated into that redesign.
And what's the timeline for that?
We're already past the initial timeline. I'm on a waiting list.
But we're number one. And so now that you've described the ongoing projects of each tab, what's a reasonable expectation for changes to happen within each tab? I know we're changing, but
So we've been kind of patient in trying to present the tabs with the idea that we were going to put them into the new template. We've now received kind of guidance from OIS is to go forward with the tabs in the existing format and get those done. And when it comes around and resources are free enough for OIS to help us with our the general redesign on the new template, they'll just work with it. So we have outstanding requests for website changes.
thank you, Jason. Look forward to that new template.
I think you'll see, graphically, it's much more appealing to the eye, but it's much more easily navigatable. It's very icon and graphic based, and not quite so crowded.
Any further board discussion? And any public comment? No public comment, but I saw some smiles back there when we talked about other state boards' websites. Okay, thank you. I think we are ready to recess for lunch. And then after lunch, we're going to be going into closed session for the rest of the afternoon and reconvening tomorrow morning at 9 a.m.
Okay.
So with that, we'll go ahead and recess for lunch. Thank you very much, April. Liz,
Thank you.
Carl.
Thank you to the board members.
Yeah.
We may want to do, actually, before
Good idea.
closed session.
Yeah, good idea. So before closed session, agenda item number 12, any public comment on items that are not on the agenda that anyone wants to discuss today? And hearing none, okay, we'll go into recess. It's 12:21. Thank you.